Imagine you're a parent in 16th century Serbia. One night, church bells start ringing, not for service, not for a wedding. It's the alarm. Ottoman soldiers are coming. You rush to hide your son, but it's too late. Officials arrive with a list. Boys between 8 and 18 are dragged to the village square. They're inspected like livestock. Teeth checked, bodies measured, reflexes tested. This was called the devshirme system, a state-run child levy. For over 600 years, Christian families across the Balkans lived with the terror that one day their sons would be stolen, converted and trained as elite soldiers called janissaries. Some of these boys never returned. Others came back decades later, not as sons, but as soldiers, pointing Ottoman rifles at the very villages they were stolen from. One boy, taken at age 10, rose to become Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, the second most powerful man in the Ottoman Empire. And what did he do with that power? He ordered raids on his own homeland, stealing boys from families just like his. This wasn't random cruelty. It was policy. Over 500,000 boys were taken. Entire villages collapsed because there were no young men left to farm, marry, or inherit. Some parents even blinded or maimed their sons to make them unfit for selection. Better a scarred child than a stolen one. As horrific as that sounds, it was just the beginning. Because while the Ottomans perfected child theft, other Islamic empires industrialized something even darker. Castration. Yes, castration, on a mass scale. Slave boys captured from Africa and Europe were marched hundreds of miles to centers in Egypt, Damascus, and beyond. There, crude procedures were performed, not in hospitals but in blacksmith shop-like conditions. The death rate? 90%. Let that sink in. 9 out of 10 boys didn't survive. Their bodies were thrown into mass graves. Archaeologists have found these sites, pits of bones belonging to boys as young as 7. Why would anyone do this? Because eunuchs, men who survived castration, were valuable. They were trusted to guard harems, run palaces, and serve rulers. Their inability to have families meant they posed no political threat. And despite the staggering death toll, the economics made sense to traders. Buy 100 boys, lose 90 to the procedure, and still make a profit selling the survivors. Some merchants even had insurance policies covering the expected losses. This wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, systematic, and lasted for centuries. We're taught that the Atlantic slave trade lasted 400 years, transporting around 12 million Africans to the Americas. It was horrific and rightly remembered as one of history's greatest crimes. But what if I told you the Islamic slave trade lasted 1,400 years, and that it enslaved 11 to 17 million Africans, most of whom didn't survive long enough to have descendants? The difference is staggering. The Atlantic trade left 42 million descendants across the Americas. The Islamic trade left virtually none. Why? Because male slaves were castrated or worked to death, while women were consumed by harems. Survival rates were abysmal. Crossing the Sahara Desert in chains meant 80% died en route. Archaeologists have literally found chains of skeletons across ancient caravan routes, still wearing shackles. In the salt mines of southern Iraq, 500,000 African slaves labored under conditions so brutal that average life expectancy was just 2 to 3 years. In 1869 CE, they rose up in the Zanj Rebellion, one of the largest slave revolts in history. It lasted 14 years, yet most people have never heard of it. Why? Because the rebels lost, and the victors erased their memory. Think about this. Historians estimate that up to 112 million Africans were lost, whether killed in raids, dying on desert marches, or never being born because their parents were taken. That's a Holocaust-level tragedy, stretched out over 14 centuries. Slavery wasn't the only tool of control. Taxes became weapons of cultural annihilation. Non-Muslims under Islamic rule paid the jizya and kharaj, crippling taxes that took 50 to 80% of everything they produced. Not profit, everything. Families starved while collectors mocked them. Fathers had to kneel to pay their taxes, struck on the neck while their children watched. It was humiliation written into law. The effect was devastating. Imagine farming all year only to have nearly everything seized. Some families had no choice but to convert to Islam just to survive. But there was a catch. Converts often couldn't inherit their parents' land. That meant family wealth was broken up and sold off. Over generations, entire communities collapsed. Not by sword, but by mathematics. It was cultural genocide in numbers. Languages, religions, and entire civilizations disappeared. Zoroastrians, ancient Egyptian Copts, even Buddhist kingdoms across Central Asia. They weren't just conquered, they were deleted. And then comes the darkest part of all, the fate of women. For 14 centuries, millions of women and girls were trafficked through markets from Crimea to Zanzibar. In one Crimean port alone, 20,000 women a year were sold. Most were between the ages of 12 and 20. The highest demand? Girls as young as 14. They were stripped, inspected, and sold into harems where they faced lives of sexual slavery. The numbers are staggering. Historians estimate 10 to 15 million women were enslaved across Islamic empires. Families were so desperate that they scarred their daughters' faces to make them undesirable to raiders. Better a scar than slavery. Inside harems, conditions were brutal. Some women bore children who were killed or enslaved. Others died by suicide or violence. Escape was nearly impossible. Palace records even kept receipts for purchases. 12 Circassian girls, ages 13 to 16, good health, intact. Their identities erased, their suffering hidden. Unlike Atlantic slavery, which left descendants who preserved memory, these women left nothing. No communities, no memorials, just silence. So why isn't this history taught? The evidence exists in Ottoman archives, Islamic legal texts, British diplomatic reports, archaeological digs, but academia avoids it. Scholars who study it face career ruin, publishers shy away, political pressure, oil money, and fear of backlash keep the subject buried. Even today, slavery persisted in some Islamic countries into the 20th century, and in some places it still exists. Unlike Atlantic slavery, this system left no descendants to demand justice, no museums, no movies, no cultural memory. It was the perfect crime. Erase the victims so completely that no one remains to speak for them. Think about what this means. We live in a world where the worst atrocities aren't always the ones remembered, where millions of children, women, and men can suffer for over a millennium, and their memory erased because it's inconvenient to acknowledge. This isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how power hides its crimes, how history is edited, and how silence allows atrocities to vanish. When we remember the Atlantic slave trade, the Holocaust, or other genocides, we honor their victims by refusing to let their stories die. But millions more victims of this 1400-year system remain voiceless. Unless we speak, they will remain erased. So now you know about the children stolen, the boys mutilated, the women trafficked, the civilizations erased. You know about the taxes that starved families, the archives that prove it, and the silence that hides it. History isn't just what you were taught in school, it's what someone decided you shouldn't learn. If this shook you, share it, talk about it, because remembering is the only justice left for the millions whose voices were erased. And ask yourself this: if history can hide 14 centuries of systematic horror, what else don't we know? If you want more suppressed history, subscribe now. Comment below what shocked you the most. Was it the stolen children, the 90% death rate in castration centers, the disappearance of entire civilizations, or the silence that hides it all? Hit like, share this video, and help bring back into memory the stories that were never meant to be told. Because history buried is history repeated, and silence is the accomplice of every atrocity.